Thank you. Two broad points for my presentation today. First, sexual abuse is a complicated problem that we are still coming to understand. Secondly, we do have programs that can prevent sexual abuse, and so we should be implementing them. A first way of appreciating the complexity is the slide. I don't think the slide is projecting there, is it? It doesn't seem to be. Oh, I maybe have to change it here.
Oh, it's on the computer.
No? Sorry for the delay here. Okay, there we go. Good. Okay, so complexity, programs that work. So one way of talking about the complexity is with this typology of different kinds of sexual abuse that we need to be aware of. So we have interfamilial sexual abuse, which typically involves fathers, stepfathers, grandfathers, uncles. This kind of abuse tends to start early and have a longer duration and is oftentimes very difficult to disclose and very difficult to manage because it disrupts the whole family. We have sexual abuse that occurs to children from a broader context of perpetrators, typically other friends of the family, fathers of children's friends, people that children come into contact with in their daily social interactions. We have a third kind of sexual abuse, which is adult leaders, teachers, and mentors. These include religious leaders, coaches, teachers in schools. Another particularly difficult kind of sexual abuse because these are people who have considerable amounts of authority, and the institutions are oftentimes very resistant to recognition and the disclosure of abuse and proper resolution of these cases. Then we have sexual abuse that occurs at the hands of other youth, an aspect of the problem that is oftentimes not sufficiently recognized. In the US, we find that about a third of the cases that come to attention are abuse at the hands of other youth. This group we break down into two main groups. Children who abuse younger children. This could be older brothers, neighborhood children. And then there are also children who abuse same-age peers. These often occur in dating and romantic relationships, but they can also occur as part of peer bullying and group humiliation and harassment of other children. So there is a complicated set of abuse that occurs within the youth peer group itself that is oftentimes not given sufficient attention. Then we have what I call statutory or compliant victim cases. These are typically teenagers, younger teenagers, who have voluntary sexual relationships with considerably older people that violate statutes that regulate the age at which a child can begin to consent to sex with an older partner. These are difficult to deal with because frequently the juvenile protects the offender, doesn't see themselves necessarily as a victim. But this is a very important group of sexual abuse cases for us to pay attention to establish the norm that adults should not be seeking sexual relationships from children. Then we have commercial sexual exploitation that can occur in tourist areas or in urban areas, that can involve children who are being prostituted by facilitators or pimps, but can also include children who are selling themselves independently. It can involve families that prostitute their own children as well. So there's a variety of different kinds of commercial sexual exploitation. And then there are these new kinds of sexual abuse that occur that are mediated by the internet, that include relationships that form online, as well as the production of child pornography, or sexual abuse images, and the dissemination and of these images to a wide audience. Another way of talking about the complexity of sexual abuse is to talk about some of the misconceptions and myths that still pertain to this particular issue. And I want to emphasize three of them, although there are many more that we could talk about. But first, most sexual abuse does not occur as a result of force and violence. It is usually as a result of the authority of the person that's involved, or the misrepresentation of norms, or the grooming or manipulation, the exchange of gifts or favors or attention in exchange for sexual access. This is very important for people to understand, because otherwise victims frequently feel like what happened to them wasn't really a crime, or wasn't really sexual abuse, or wasn't their fault, because they weren't physically coerced. And oftentimes parents and others don't recognize when it's occurring because they're looking for a different dynamic, or that they don't believe or they blame the child because it doesn't correspond to this idea that they had that it should have involved violence. So this is a very important point to make in education. A second complexity about the issue is how we think about perpetrators. We've taken this word that you have given us from Greece, pedophilia, and I think very badly misused it. Most sexual abusers are not technically pedophiles, which is a person who has a primary and enduring sexual interest in prepubescent children. In fact, all of the children and youth who commit abuse, those aren't pedophiles. A large number of the offenses are against teenage and post-pubescent children. Those offenders typically aren't pedophiles. And even a large group of the people who sexually abuse prepubescent children aren't actually pedophiles themselves in the sense of having a sexual orientation towards that group. They are more opportunistic kinds of offenders. And this is a very important thing for people to recognize, because thinking that these offenders are pedophiles makes people think that they could be looking for a certain kind of personality, a certain kind of disorder, a certain kind of continuing orientation. But that's not who we're going to be finding when we look for abusers. A third very important misconception for people to understand is that disclosure does not always or even usually bring benefits for the victim, because they frequently get negative responses from family and friends. They find themselves exposed in their situation, revealed to lots of people that they would rather not know about it, and they are subject to investigations which frequently compound the harm. So any recognition of the problem has to start with the enormous difficulties and burdens that children have to disclose this, and all the obstacles that stand in their way, the loyalty that they often feel to offenders in spite of the harm that's been caused, the tendency to blame themselves for what happened and see themselves as at fault, the sense of shame and embarrassment they have about what happened and what their involvement was, fear of retaliation from the abusers or from other family members or people who are close to the offender, doubt about whether they're going to be believed, a realistic doubt in many cases, fear about losing control of what's going to be happening. Indeed, they typically do lose control because of the various mechanisms of investigation and case management that come into play. And then misconceptions that young people have about what the justice system does and how it works. We have to understand all of these features in order to be able to counteract them and reassure children and encourage disclosures. So moving on quickly in this short presentation to prevention, because we have a lot of things that we have now found to work and that have some scientific evidence behind them for their efficacy. I like to put up this a little bit complicated model because it really shows us that there are four main places where we can apply our prevention strategies: to the motivations that offenders have to commit abusive acts, to their ability to inhibit themselves from engaging in these acts, to the protections that surround children in their environment through their parents and the community, and through the children's ability themselves to resist the sexual overtures. And many of the interventions that we have, many of the prevention efforts that we have, apply to a number of these avenues. So here are 6 prevention strategies which all have some evidence behind them as being successful, and I'll go through them one by one. Maybe the most important one, and the one that's had the most research behind it, are school-based education for young people throughout the school period. One of the things that's been proven without a doubt is that school-based education can be very successful in all kinds of domains, in dissuading children from using drugs, from engaging in risky sexual behavior, in engaging in delinquency and bullying. So there's a long tradition of success in this area. In the area of sexual abuse specifically, one of the great benefits of prevention education for school-age children is that it can address so many of the elements of the sexual abuse problem. It can give young people information about what proper norms are with regard to sexual behavior. It can teach them resistance skills so that they can avoid situations where there's risk. It can help them to disclose and see the reasons why they should disclose. It can mobilize other children to be active bystanders and give support to victims and also make disclosures on behalf of victims. It can reduce the stigma that children feel by having them realize that it's not their fault or that this happens to other people, that they're not alone in this having happened. And it can also address offenders directly, or at least individuals who might grow up to be offenders, by both explaining to them what the standards are, but also letting them know the consequences if they engage in this behavior and the likelihood that they will be discovered and caught, because everybody is being trained to recognize these behaviors. The research on this area shows clearly that children do learn the concepts. They can acquire the skills. This learning is sustained over time, although it works best when it's repeated, typically on a yearly basis, and involves programs that involve multiple components over a number of sessions. But these programs have been shown to be successful with children. These are the names of some of the programs that have been researched and have been demonstrated to be successful, talking about touching, a program called Child Assault Prevention. These are all programs that I know of from the US, where most of the research has been done. A program called Safe Dates, Shifting Boundaries, Green Dot, Fourth R, Second Step. If you want more information on any of these, I'd be happy to help you get in touch with the developers of these programs. Okay, a second very important prevention strategy is providing information to parents. Parents have the opportunity to be able to give information to young children. Children as young as 3 or 4 benefit from having some information, basic information that can help them be safe, that can teach them about private body parts, that can give them names for these private body parts. Parents also need information to be accurate in their ability to detect risk and anticipate situations where children might be in danger or people who might be dangerous to the child, and help children prevent the abuse from occurring in those situations. There are programs to educate parents, typically that go along with some of the school-age prevention programs as well. Then there are more general community awareness and community education programs. I have a sense that you probably have some of these here in Greece already. These programs are targeted at improving guardianship so that people in the population at large are aware that sexual abuse occurs and the kinds of dynamics that happen so that they can notice things that are happening and prevent them from occurring. It also provides information to potential offenders about the fact that people are on the lookout, that this behavior is wrong and problematic, and also lets them know that they won't be able to get away with it. It facilitates disclosure because there are more people who are prepared to are open to hearing about a child who may have had this happen to them. And it also reduces the stigma because people are more aware about the problem and are less likely to be surprised and shocked when they hear about these cases. There are several modalities for this general public awareness raising. One of them is through hotlines where people who are interested or concerned can get information. Another way is through public advertising on televisions and the internet and billboards. Sometimes these just alert people to the fact that children are being abused. Some of these are directed specifically at offenders to get help or to stop themselves from engaging in impulses that they might have. Some of these public awareness programs actually take groups of people and train them about more of the details of sexual abuse. There's a program called Darkness to Light in the United States, which does an educational program of just people in the general public who have an interest in the problem. A fourth promising prevention strategy is the efforts to make youth-serving organizations less vulnerable to sexual abuse. The churches, the schools, the youth-serving organizations. There's now a pretty well-developed plan for what these organizations need to do to strengthen their protections. They need to implement various kinds of screening procedures to make sure that problematic employees and problematic volunteers don't come to work in the organization, but that people who are applying also understand that this is an organization that takes this kind of problem very seriously so that they would even screen themselves out. It also sets clear standards and norms for behaviors, things like no showering together, adults and children in this facility, or adults should not be alone on a one-to-one basis with children in automobiles or sleeping together in trips that are taken. There needs to be an environmental analysis of the kinds of situations in the organization that pose a danger, so places where privacy and secrecy can happen, or places like where people will be spending nights away from home, where dangerous interactions can occur. These staff and the volunteers in these organizations need to be trained in what are called mentoring management skills, understanding that they may be provoked in various ways, that there may be sexual feelings that come up for them in certain situations, but they have to take care not to allow themselves to get into a dangerous situation with regard to this, that they can get help, that they can inhibit this, that they can put some distance between themselves and children. These are important skills for people who are going to be working with children to learn. There has to be education provided for the children and the parents who are going to be involved in this organization to know what the rules are so that they can detect violations of these rules and bring them to the attention of the organization. And there has to be an effort throughout the organization, the staff and the parents and the children, to promote disclosure, to say that they're eager to hear about violations of the rules and problematic situations that seem to pose danger. And they have to be welcoming and accepting these things and making that clear. A fifth important prevention strategy that you'll be hearing more about has to do with training for law enforcement. The key element in law enforcement is that much sexual abuse can be deterred and prevented if people or offenders recognize that they're very likely to be caught, that this is something that they can't get away with. And so making sure that cases get disclosed is very important. And the way we achieve that is by having law enforcement agencies who are well-trained, sensitive to children, open to receiving these kinds of disclosures, and are able to advertise the fact that they are doing these kinds of things. They convey to the public that they have this kind of sensitivity and are open for these kinds of disclosures. So you'll be hearing more about that as we go along in the day. Finally, another strong prevention strategy that has a lot of evidence is treatment for offenders, both the juvenile and adult offenders who engage in this behavior, to ensure that they don't continue to engage in such behavior and involve other children. There's quite a bit of research on the treatment. The treatment modalities for the youth offenders have very high levels of success, and there's relatively low rates of recidivism among the youth who get these kinds of programs. But the adult treatment programs also have been shown to be effective in reducing the likelihood of reoffending as well. There's also some evidence behind intensive probation systems that monitor offenders when they get back out in the community and give them social supports and therapists so that they don't reoffend. There are other strategies, including sentencing provisions and registries for offenders, that have been evaluated and have not been shown to be particularly successful. But the bottom line is, there is very good news from parts of the world that have been implementing these kinds of prevention strategies. In the US, we have had very large declines in sexual abuse over the last 20 to 25 years as awareness has grown and these kinds of programs have been implemented. And I feel very confident that when other places take on this kind of mobilization, they can have similar kinds of success in reducing the toll of sexual abuse. The signs are that in many countries that have taken on these responsibilities, the situation is improving. And I think you should have confidence that as you do more of this in Greece, you will have similar kinds of success. Thank you very much, and I'll be available for the rest of the day for questions.